Miss Sajida Kala, who is a history teacher in Dallas, Texas. She received her MA in history from SOAS, the University of London, in 2001. She studied Arabic, Islamic history, and foundational Islamic sciences for several years at the Kalam Institute, and has utilized her knowledge in various teaching positions in the US and South Africa. Sajida's research and academic interests lie in analyzing and understanding Islam and its intersections with politics, social justice, culture, secularism, and modernity, as it relates both historically and currently. The title of her paper is The Emergence, Involvement, and Attitudes of Progressive and Conservative Muslim Organizations in Apartheid South Africa. Thank you very much. Take it away.
Thank you, James. Share my screen. Okay, so my name is Sajida Kala. I am presenting on the emergence, involvement, and attitudes of progressive and conservative Muslim organizations in apartheid South Africa from 1960 to 1990. So during this time, Muslims struggled to determine where they stood, who they aligned with, and what they should do. So specifically, what Islam says about resisting oppression in a non-Muslim state. So the purpose of this research is to look at conservative organizations versus progressive, and look at how they both utilize the Quran and Sunnah to justify their actions or non-actions during the apartheid. By progressive organizations, I mean those that advocated for change and actually took an active stance against apartheid, whereas the conservative ones are those that generally chose silence or complacency and followed the teachings of traditional Deoband ulama. So those are the Hanafi school of thought that originated in Southeast Asia. Some of the key questions that I tried to tackle were what were their respective responses to apartheid laws and the anti-apartheid struggle? What stimulated the emergence of these organizations in the first place? And why was it so important that fighting against oppression be Islamically correct? As well as what did the leaders of these organizations see the ultimate struggle being about? So did they participate in the national anti-apartheid struggle, or was it something specific to Islam? Oops. Okay, so we're going to start with conservatism. So Islam has a long history of conservatism in South Africa, and something that they emphasized was taqleed, which is imitation or following the teachings of previous scholars. The first organization is the Muslim Judicial Council, which was established in 1945, and they believe themselves to be the custodians of Islamic principles, as in representatives of the entire Muslim community. And their primary goals were to promote religious education amongst Muslims, issue legally binding religious decrees, and unify the Muslim community. The second is the Majlis al-Ulama of South Africa, which was established in the 1950s by someone named Maulana Ahmed Sadiq Desai, who was a traditional Deoband scholar from Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape, South Africa. And he established this as a representative theological body to address Muslim affairs. So the MJC was a little bit more of a moderate conservative, whereas the Majlis al-Ulama was more right-wing conservative. So their main arguments were, number one, freedom of religion equals obedience to the government or state laws. So if you as a Muslim were allowed to practice your Islam and fulfill all your religious obligations, then fighting against the authority was not Islamically permissible. The second is focusing on improving one's state of Iman. So preserving your Iman was the most important thing for conservatives. The third one is kuffar and kuffar politics. This is something that's specific to Maulana Desai from the Majlis al-Ulama. He specifically believed that contemporary modern politics, he basically called that kuffar politics. So if you were participating in political parties or participating in anything politically involved, then you were deemed to be kufr, meaning you were out of the fold of Islam. So it was a very sort of brazen statement. In his idea, politics in Islam was only solely for the purpose of establishing a Sharia compliant state. The fourth is that ulama are Islam's traditional gatekeepers, so those that Muslims turn to for Islamic guidance and knowledge, that we turn to as models for how to behave and act in society. However, at a time when silence was synonymous with complacency, South African Muslims started to question the dominance and hegemony that the ulama had over the community. And the last one is a fear of fitna meaning the social and moral ills of society that could lead you out of Islam or away from Islam. And so the great fitna was something that was kind of sort of in the subconscious of their minds, which is that's the division between Sunni and Shia, the civil war that happened after their Prophet Muhammad's death. And so a lot of Sunnis left that and were left with an impression that in a situation of conflict, it was better to stand back. And so this is kind of what led to that apprehension amongst South African ulama and conservatives, and that it was better to just stand back and stay silent rather than have a stance, a political stance. And so they used fitna as a justification for their non-action. The second topic is progressivism. So the first organization here is the Qibla mass movement in radicalism, formed in July 1981 by Ahmed Qasim. And his progressivism and radicalism started at a young age of 14 when he witnessed his first anti-pass campaign that was organized by the PAC, the Pan-African Congress. And from the age of 17, that was when he was first arrested. From 1963 until sort of the end of apartheid, he was regularly detained and imprisoned and then released and then banned. And he was more radical than other progressives. The basis for his ideology was the quote on the right, which is, "The only people in the world who have the sole justification for resorting to armed struggle, to violence, to force, are the oppressed people. Nobody else has that right or justification, but more importantly, it is immoral, obscene for an oppressor to tell the oppressed how they should respond to oppression." So if there are two principles that we should teach all oppressed people, then it is those two principles. Every human being and animal has the right to self-defense. I'm non-violent to non-violent people only. The second most important thing for Qibla was jihad, and members of Qibla saw themselves as mujahideen who were fighting against oppression and injustice and exploitation. And they based their idea off of prophetic examples, so they redefined jihad to fit the context of South Africa. And the apartheid became analogous to slavery that Prophet Musa and the children of Israel experienced, or it became analogous to the oppression that early Muslims faced in Mecca. One of the verses that they used was chapter 2, verse 193 in the Quran, which states, "Fight against them if they persecute you until there is no more persecution, and your devotion will be to God alone. If they stop persecuting you, let there be no hostility except against the aggressors." So they used jihad to challenge the state at rallies or at mosque meetings, at funerals, and also they participated in armed struggle. The other thing about Qasim is that he lacked traditional training, so he engaged with the Quran and interpreted the Quran using only an English translation. So he lacked any formal theological training that generally was required to make exegetical commentaries. But his Quranic exegesis was based on rationality and contextualizing verses, which appealed to a lot of people. As for alliances, they were only allied with the PAC because they shared a similar ideology of armed struggle. Other than that, they they actually oppose alliances, especially alliances with non-Muslims. Okay, the next one is Call of Islam and Religious Pluralism. So Ibrahim Rasool and Farid Ishaq were the founders of this organization. They founded it on June 17th, 1984. They held a mass rally at a Primrose Park mosque and basically presented this new organization there. They advocated for non-racial, non-sexist, nuclear-free, democratic, and undivided South Africa. And they believed that that could only be achieved through alliances, friendships, and cooperation with non-Muslims, which is very, very different from Qibla. Just a little background about the two of them. Both Farid Ishaq and Ibrahim Rasool experienced were forcibly removed from their homes as children under the GAA, which was the Group Areas Act that basically created racially segregated areas. Ishaq had a very positive experience with his Christian neighbors that instilled in him this idea of religious pluralism and interreligious cooperation and solidarity. Ishaq himself was traditionally taught. He studied in Karachi, Pakistan, where he qualified as a Maulana. And for the rest of his life, he kind of had to reconcile his traditional conservative education with his newer progressive perspective. So their arguments and beliefs, their foundation was chapter 57, verse 25, which states, "We have indeed sent our messengers with clear proofs and sent down with them the book and the balance so that people may uphold justice." So in different exegesis of this verse, justice is said that it is established and protected through divine rights and outlined in the Quran, and that humans are obligated to uphold that justice in society. The second thing that was very important to them was historical contextualization. So Ishaq criticized the ulama for their taqleed and for basically having a very narrow and strict interpretation of the Quran and not allowing for the diversity of thought that exists. So he promoted the idea of using asbab al-nuzul, which are the reasons for revelation. So looking at the time, the location, and the context for why a verse was revealed. And then using that, you can apply it to modern day context and apply it to the South African apartheid. The other thing he created was called the Quranic liberation theology, which was based on praxis in hermeneutics, which promoted the idea of freedom of all people from all forms of injustice and exploitation, including whether that was race, gender, class, or religion. And so he uses hermeneutics to reinterpret Islam through the lens and perspective of those who are oppressed and marginalized to then establish justice and equality in society. He identified 6 hermeneutical keys, and the most important one is Tawheed. And he used these hermeneutical keys to interpret the Quran. So Tawheed, which is the unity of God, he says that this is the antithesis of apartheid, because whereas apartheid divides people along these ethnic lines, Tawheed unites people, unifies people regardless of any sort of categorization or division. Lastly, religious pluralism became the cornerstone of Ishaq's liberation theology. It supported sort of his desire to embrace this religious other as allies in the struggle and in the national anti-apartheid struggle. And so in chapter 5, verses 46 to 48, it describes the revelations of Prophet Isa and Prophet Musa, and that it is part of our iman as Muslims to believe in the existence and the authenticity of all prophets and all messengers, and therefore all scriptures that have been revealed, so that there is religious pluralism there. And with that, there's alliances with non-Muslims. So a lot of the conservatives believe that alliances with non-Muslims was prohibited, meaning you were not allowed to align yourself with a non-Muslim organization. But Isaac kind of took this to mean, we have to look at the prohibition of alliances, which is in the Quran, from its historical perspective and context. And so he said that it is permissible to ally yourself with non-Muslims and non-Muslim organizations, as long as it's not sort of hindering your own faith, as long as you're preserving and protecting your own faith. And so he gives examples of like the Prophet's uncle, Abu Talib, who was not a non-Muslim, but was still had a very loving and trustworthy relationship with the Prophet, or the Christian king of Abyssinia, who welcomed and protected the Muslims when they were being persecuted in Mecca. The last topic is Islam and politics, modernism, and justice. So what is politics in Islam? So conservatives insisted that unless you were creating a Sharia-compliant state, then you need to abstain from political activity. Isaac disagreed and asserted that politics is actually a fard kifaya, meaning it is a community obligation in which at least one person must be involved in it for the betterment of society in the Muslim community. When it comes to ousting governments and obedience to rulers, there's 3 different aspects, and there are differences of opinion regarding these. For armed rebellion, it is only permitted when there is undeniable evidence of the ruler's disobedience, assuming that the ruler is Muslim, or if Muslims are being legally obstructed from practicing their religion. So a lot of jurists, fuqaha, including Abu Hanifa, argue that armed rebellions are counterproductive because they do result, or they could possibly result in bloodshed. When it comes to self-defense, if your right to obey God is violated, in which case then you are obligated to fight back in self-defense. And so there are a lot of hadith that are stated about obedience to a ruler. And so Mufti Taqi Usmani, who is a well-renowned Pakistani Islamic scholar, has kind of interpreted these hadiths to mean that it doesn't mean that it's impermissible to defend yourself, but rather it's impermissible to violently rebel against a ruler. That's what it means when you can't disobey a ruler. And so he argues that oppressive rulers must be ousted, but in a peaceful manner first, before armed rebellion is taken into consideration. For change and reform, this is generally part of modernization, is change and reform, right? And so Islam and Sharia are structured to facilitate the adaptation and incorporation of new ideas as society evolves. And so a lot of the conservatives were very apprehensive about change and reform, whereas progressives kind of took that and ran with it. And they really believed that change and reform in all aspects of Islam was necessary to make Islam more accessible to its own community. Islam as a way of life became a focal point for progressives. Isaac and other progressives believed that there's a difference between having freedom of religion and freedom of worship. So they argue that South African Muslims had freedom of worship because they could practice their religion freely, in a way, but they couldn't practice, they could worship freely, but they couldn't practice their religion in all its aspects and sort of and live according to Islamic morals and ethics. So the importance of acting justly and living according to justice is something that's also found in the Quran. And in chapter 5, verse 8, this is what progressives use as well. It states, "O you who have believed, be persistently standing firm for God, witnesses in justice, and do not let the hatred of a people prevent you from being just. Be just, that is nearer to righteousness, and fear God. Indeed, God is acquainted with what you do." So God here is urging Muslims to be just and behave in a just manner and deal justly with others. And so overall, Islam and Sharia were designed and constructed to serve and protect all people. And that's where a lot of progressives came to view Islam as a guidance and a way of life, not just a religion of rituals. Some final thoughts. I think that the flexibility, what we have here is like two different views of progressives and conservatives who both have utilized the Quran and Sunnah to come to very drastically different interpretations. And so that's kind of indicative of the flexibility of the Quran, but also in the fact that as society evolves and modernizes, it was necessary to reinterpret the Quran from a different perspective and a different lens. As the Prophet Muhammad famously stated, this is an often quoted hadith, whoever of you sees an evil, let him change it with his hand. If he cannot, then with his tongue, and if he cannot, then with his heart, then that would be the weakest of faith. So Islam teaches Muslims to correct what is evil and to act against evil and to educate others to do so as well. So fighting against evil is actually an individual Islamic duty that we have, which is an essential element of Iman. And finally, I will leave you with this. Freed Isaac aptly states that our task is to live out our Islam and to do so in a way that relates to the reality of people around us. Our Islam cannot function in a vacuum. The message of Islam must be heard where the suffering is felt most, because Islam undoubtedly is the message of justice, not just any justice, but divine justice. Thank you so much.